paradox of data-driven innovation. So, bit about me, I'm president of Intellix, and Intellix is an industry analyst firm, and we focus on digital transformation and helping organizations achieve the business agility they need to achieve their digital transformation goals. So I also write for Forbes, Wired, and a number of blogs, etc. And I also, in fact, wrote a couple of Forbes articles interviewing a couple of the speakers you've already heard at this conference. So, and I'll tell you how to find those articles at the end. So, as an industry analyst, I have sort of the luxury of having sort of a bigger picture perspective on the topic of this session, of this conference. Because as a focus on digital transformation, that gives me the strategic view. So when I'd say digital transformation, what's happening today in the marketplace is that organizations, large organizations are achieving a greater focus on their customer than perhaps they have before, and it's driven by customer behavior, something that we've heard other speakers talk about. So customers are now using multiple technology touch points, they're interacting with the companies they interact with in new and different ways, and that's driving enterprises to change how they interact with a customer, and that's impacting the organization across the board as well as the technology, the IT organization. So there's enormous transformation within organizations as they meet this new customer-driven need. So that's a strategic way of thinking about marketing, right? A lot of the sessions at this conference have been more tactical, right? How do we leverage big data and various technologies to improve our marketing? But if you think about it, providing value to the customer and interacting with the customer the way the customer wants to be interacted with is essentially a marketing challenge. So we're still talking about marketing, we're just sort of expanding the discussion to that higher level. So I'm also talking about innovation, and innovation is a key part of this story as well, because organizations are forced to change and to roll out new products, new services in the context of this digital marketing world. So they're being driven by the marketplace pressures in order to innovate. So here's a quote, right? Henry Ford and innovation. Everybody's heard this quote, right? If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. How many of you think that Henry Ford actually said that? I gave it away. He never said that, right? That's not what Henry Ford said, and in reality, doesn't even represent his perspective on innovation. So it's sort of interesting because you would think, well, this is something he would have said, but in reality, it isn't. So what is the real story behind Henry Ford's innovation? Well, his innovation was leveraging economies of scale. It was the assembly line and the fact that building automobiles with an assembly line could lower the cost per unit, and that expanded the market for the automobile, right? Before he came along, automobiles were luxury items, right? That was his innovation. But if you think about it, he had this sort of big data gap, right? He didn't really understand what the market was looking for. Yes, people wanted automobiles, and by making them less expensive, now it increased his market, but he had a quote, and this was his quote, that he would provide any color the customers wanted as long as it was black. That is a Henry Ford quote. That is the way he thought, right? Because by achieving massive economies of scale, right, means all the cars are the same, the Model T was the same, he was able to achieve his true innovation. The problem here is that eventually it didn't take long for customers to want variety, and he wasn't offering variety. It took years before the Model A came out, so who benefited from Henry Ford's big data marketing mistake? It was General Motors, because General Motors delivered variety. Not only a variety of different brands that they have to this day, but the whole model year system, where every year they came out with a new version. General Motors invented that, so not only did that satisfy customers' desire for the fashion aspect, something new every year, but obviously it drove huge revenues for General Motors because people had a reason to trade in the cars after only 1 year. So there's a lesson to be learned here, right? So what about the data? Right? Henry Ford had data in his day, so did General Motors. Obviously not the sort of technology that we leverage today, but you could still do surveys. There's still ways to collect data on customer buying behavior, on customer preferences. So what was the challenge? Well, the challenge is it's difficult to drive innovation with data. And this really depends upon the nature of the innovation, right? When we talk about innovation, there's essentially a spectrum, right? At one end, the end that I'm really focusing on, are the disruptive innovations. Brand new products or services that are so different, people didn't even know they wanted them until they hit the market, right? Those are the sorts of innovations that are truly disruptive and give our organizations, if we're able to actually deploy one, a huge competitive advantage. Now, the other end of this spectrum are the minor tweaks, the next model year innovation. Oh, we're going to add fins this year, that's innovative. Well, you need to do that as well, and it gives you an advantage in the marketplace if you can innovate by incrementally. But what I'm really talking about here are the more disruptive innovations. The incremental innovations, those can be reasonably data-driven. Right, you have a sense as to what customers want, what customers would prefer, and you can add new features to your product based upon focus groups or other data, and that's fine. But the disruptive innovations are a different story. So one great example is, of course, the Walkman, right? iPad is another. Nobody knew they wanted a Walkman before Sony rolled them out, so obviously focus groups wouldn't help. Right, you can't ask people if they wanted to be able to carry a cassette player, battery powered, with headphones with them, because nobody had heard of such a thing. The same with the iPad. Steve Jobs famously never used focus groups, because focus groups only tell you if there's a perceived demand for a product, but there isn't ahead of a truly innovative product. So this is now a big data conundrum. Right? Yes, we can roll out a new and improved product leveraging big data, but how do we innovate disruptively? And how can we do it? How can we get better at doing that? Okay, so in reality, when you think about how organizations use data today, it's focused more on optimization. This is true within the marketing world and more broadly in terms of how organizations essentially manage themselves. Typically, data are focused on optimization. So another way of saying that is that executives manage to their business outcomes, their key performance indicators. Let's improve profitability. Let's lower costs. Let's gain market share, right? Lift is a key word for marketers, right? These are key performance indicators that managers manage to. And they'll use the data at their disposal to improve those, to optimize those. The challenge is, the more you do that, the less able you are to deal with disruptive innovations, because optimization and disruption work at odds with each other. So the better you manage in a traditional sort of MBA sense, the less innovative an organization you end up with. So what I like to call this is the better, faster, cheaper problem. And I didn't make up that name. That was actually a phrase that NASA came up with when they analyzed the Columbia space shuttle disaster, because they fell into this problem as well, right? They were forced to cut costs, be more efficient, improve productivity, and that limited their ability to deal with unexpected problems. And that's exactly what caused the Columbia to crash. So instead of being more innovative, we're becoming more brittle. So how do you manage? Or not necessarily you personally, but how do your executives manage your organizations? Well, you're focusing on this better, faster, cheaper, and then repeating, and the result is that you end up essentially with a brittle organization. So when I say brittle, right, ability to fail, well, on the one hand, technology can be brittle, but the organization can be brittle as well, where the organization is just unable to deal with unexpected situations that are outside the norm. But innovation deals with those sorts of unexpected situations. They're unexpected products and services, or dealing with unexpected disruptions that are being forced upon you by either external forces or introduced internally in order to drive innovation. So, if you're unable to deal with these expected situations, you need a different approach. And this is something that NASA realized, right? They need a different approach. They can't just be managing to better, faster, cheaper. They have to have a different way of dealing with unexpected situations as well as expected situations. Because there could be failure at any point, and it's unexpected. And so any piece of the story, any part of the organization could be the weakest link. Could be a person, could be a piece of technology, but more often than not, it's a collection. It's a systemic problem. There's some sort of systemic issue having to do with the way things are done generally. So it's hard to point to a particular person or piece of technology and say, well, we just have to fix that. Okay, so how do we actually organize for innovation? We're large organizations, we still have to manage costs, we still have to be, compliant with regulations, we still have to deal with all of the traditional enterprise concerns, but we also want to innovate. Well, we need to have people focused on innovation. Not necessarily everybody, but there have to be, groups of people within our organization that we facilitate innovativeness. So, key principle here is to move from high connectivity to low connectivity. And connectivity can be both technical, where people are always online and always communicating and are always in touch with their teams and their management. But it can also be organizational, right? So a lot of times what large companies need to do in order to be more innovative is they spin off groups, put them geographically in a different place. Don't manage them on a day-to-day basis. Give them general goals and let them self-organize. So this is a key organizational principle for essentially enabling creative people to be creative and to either introduce disruption or deal better with disruption in their organizations. Perhaps the most transformative part of this story is these, innovative teams should ideally be cross-organizational. They're not just marketing folks, not just product folks, but in today's digital world, they're the marketing product folks plus the developers and the testers and the operations people. It's a mix of technical and business-focused people that self-organize. So you can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to take these 12 people and assign them to this innovation team, right? Because they'll struggle with politics and different skills. Rather, you have a large pool of people, and you say, well, here's a general goal. Who wants to volunteer? And we'll figure out, and then once you volunteer, figure out how you want to organize yourself. Who does what? Who participates? Right. So there were some conversations yesterday about analytical people being creative, and it's like, well, that's not really their skill set, but maybe they can be creative, and it's going to be rare. Well, everybody has an element of creativity, but you can't just tell an analytics person, well, use 10% of your time to be creative. It's like, what the hell does that mean? But if you say, well, here we have this innovation project with general goals, do you want to participate? And if you do, get together with the other volunteers and figure out what you're going to do in order to make this happen. Well, then people's inherent creativity will come to the fore. So we have these two different principles, two different ways, or I guess priorities, corporate priorities. We have optimization and we have innovation. And as large organizations, we need to do both, right? It's not like I'm saying you have to do one or have to do the other. Obviously, we still have to optimize. We want to establish feedback loops, the better, faster, cheaper, that optimize business outcomes. Because that's how we improve our profitability, improve our marketing lift, cut our costs, and all of the traditional metrics. And we obviously still have to do those things. But now we also want to innovate, which means introducing or leveraging disruption in our environment. And that is an essential organizational principle for allowing creativity to flourish. So, one of the challenges, the challenge there for management is balancing these two, optimization and innovation. And one of the ways I like to illustrate the nature of this challenge is with the optimization pitfall, which is the problem of local maxima, right? If you're focusing just on optimization, it's like being out in the woods where you're trying to get to the top of that mountain, there in the distance. And you don't really know the way to go. So one way you could possibly get to the top of the mountain is wherever you happen to be, simply go uphill, right? And the theory is that if wherever you are, you go uphill, eventually you'll be at the top of the mountain. Well, is that going to work? Well, possibly, but more likely it won't. You'll end up at the top of some local hill, right? Because, you know, the terrain is unpredictable and uneven, and if you go uphill, you'll end up at the top of something, but it won't necessarily be the mountain you're looking to be at the top of, right? So this is the problem of local optima, and it happens anytime you repeat an optimization task, even within business. So, and this happens all the time in businesses. You know, the department will say, well, we have to optimize these numbers, so they optimize and optimize and optimize, and they end up at a point, and then they realize some competitor beat them to something entirely new, and even though they optimized, they are at a competitive disadvantage, right? So how do you solve this problem? Well, you have to introduce a measure of disruption. So instead of just going uphill wherever you are, you say, well, you know, I'm going to walk for a random amount of time in a random distance, and then try going uphill. And that might work. At least you won't get stuck on just one hill. You might end up on a different hill, and if you do it long enough, eventually you might find the mountain. Well, it's still a bit of a random walk kind of affair. It won't necessarily get us where we want to go. But this is the challenge, right? How do we know, especially if we can't see that mountain, right? We don't know what that answer is going to be. What is that innovation that is going to blow the lid off our market next year? Well, if we haven't invented it yet, we don't know what it is. So we have to have some way of allowing for this disruption while still running our business. So what is innovativeness? Well, it's a key component of business agility. And essentially, it's the ability to introduce change intentionally into your business environment in order to achieve a strategic advantage. So, a strategic advantage, right, like increasing market share by rolling out a new product. That's a strategic advantage. Well, you want to have innovativeness to do this well. The challenge, though, is that innovation requires disruption. That's the whole local optima problem. We have to shake things up, do something unexpected if we're meaning to introduce, if we want to introduce disruption. Sometimes, of course, the disruption is forced upon us. You know, the competition did something, or a new regulation, or new global pressure, or some external disruption. But the most innovative organizations introduce their own disruption. They'd rather disrupt everybody else instead of waiting around to be disrupted, right? So these are all a central part of being innovative. So innovation requires disruption, but disruption requires risk. And this is where a lot of executives start getting a little uncomfortable. It's like, well, this whole random walk thing, it might not work. And that's true. It might take you into a worse place rather than a better place, right? There are risks here, and disruption is inherently risky. There's inherent unpredictability, so you don't necessarily know if it's going to work out. So, this is where it becomes important to balance optimization and disruption. If you do only optimization without disruption, you'll stifle innovation. You'll end up at the top of some hill, and it won't be the right hill, unless you get lucky. But disruption without optimization is just a crapshoot, right? There's no rhyme or reason to it. You haven't been smart about how you're innovating. And that happens quite a lot. You see a lot of startups doing that. You know, just some team of, hotshot entrepreneurs get together and say, we have this fabulous idea, and they get some money and they start working really hard. And sometimes it works, but what about 90% of the time it doesn't? And they end up with some, failed innovation that the market didn't take to, because it was just sort of a random process. And sometimes you get lucky. So for a large organization where you want to make innovation a part of your day-to-day business, you have to balance these two. You should optimize what you can, where appropriate, and disrupt what you must in order to be innovative, and then leverage optimization in your disruption or in your innovation activities as appropriate. And they have to achieve the appropriate balance. So, where do we get to that appropriate balance? Well, we need a level of flexibility among our people as well as with our technology. And unfortunately, those two axes are not necessarily correlated. So horizontal axis is technology, from less to more flexible. Vertical axis is people, from less to more flexible. Well, some organizations have the bad luck of being the lower left-hand corner, right? Rigid, brittle organizations, no transformation, no innovation. Hopefully you're not there. If you are, you want to somehow move away from that lower left-hand corner. The way most organizations do that is they go along one axis or the other. Either end up with more flexible people or end up with more flexible technology. Both have challenges. Some cases, making your technology more flexible is the easier part. Oh yeah, we'll start doing cloud. We'll start doing big data. We'll start doing social media. But your people are still stuck in the old way of thinking, right? And where do you end up there? Well, you end up with tone-deaf digital efforts. I saw the perfect slide yesterday on that, with all of these social media, Twitter faux pas, where people tweeted all these off-kilter ideas because the organization hadn't kept up with the technology, right? So there's a lot of risk there. You don't end up being terribly innovative if you have all this technology and you're using it improperly. Now, the other axis, if your technology is inflexible, traditional IT tends to be very inflexible, and now your people, you have this digital team driven by the marketers, and they want to do all this cool stuff because they figured out how to be flexible as an organization. Well, now we have this challenge because here's the stodgy old IT, and they don't know how to move quickly enough. They're slow. They have all these policies and procedures, all this ancient technology, and here's the digital marketing team, right? And they're moving really fast, and now we have this bifurcation. The challenge there is, of course, that those two groups have to work together efficiently in order to move the organization forward. So the real goal is to do both at once, more flexible people and technology. So, as a result, there's a new role for management. Your managers, your executives, need to properly balance disruption and optimization, and that's a challenge. There's no hard and fast recipe for that. So that's one of these still sort of open questions. But this is the way the most innovative organizations actually run. If you look at Apple Computer, something like that, they know how to optimize and they know how to disrupt, and they're able to balance the two. So better ways to manage? Well, build cross-organizational teams. In the IT world, we call this DevOps, short for development and operations, working together as one. But the real win is connecting that to the business. So biz DevOps. And in the digital world, it's driven by marketing, because marketing is responsible for the customer interaction. So customer driving business and technology decisions organizationally cutting across all your silos. Very difficult, but that's why digital transformation is transformation. Right, so leverage data to understand when to optimize, when to innovate. So the data help inform that decision. Embrace disruption. And how do you facilitate these teams? You give them the tools they need, including all of the data tools that we've been talking about the last 2 days, and then get out of their way, right? Don't manage them. Let them do their thing. Give them overall goals, give them all the tools they need, and get out of their way. So that's the end of my talk. There's my email, my Twitter handle, and this is a new thing for me. If you send an email right now, since all of you have your phones or your laptops, to that DM at Intellix, that's a simple autoresponder. You'll get back an automated email, just one, only one. You're not subscribed to anything, and that automatic response will give you a link to the presentation. It'll give you a link to those 2 Forbes articles where I interviewed other speakers. It'll give you a link to subscribe to the newsletter, which is optional, and you can always opt out, and other information, where I'm speaking and whatnot, but just a single email. So do that now, if you want the presentation. Of course, the IE folks will have the video as well, so you can always come to their site. Okay, questions? It's always the back corner, isn't it? Yeah.
Jason, that was really interesting. There were a couple of questions I have. One is, do you have any case studies of companies that have successfully implemented this approach? And second, is there a role to play for an agile kind of environment to facilitate innovation because of those rapid sprints?
Yeah, well, I love that. I love both questions. Well, the first question, the real success stories tend to be on the web scale side. In fact, another Forbes article I wrote is on Netflix. And Netflix is perhaps one of the best stories on how they were able to achieve this sort of innovation. But Spotify is another example. There's actually a Spotify fellow in the next room. I don't know if he can answer this question. But this is part of the story today, is a lot of these web scale companies, the Facebooks and Netflixes and Spotifys of the world, are the ones that have figured this stuff out. And they don't have a lot of that legacy enterprise baggage. The challenge is for the traditional enterprises that do have the baggage, that are heavily regulated, that have many departmental silos. And those organizations are struggling with this, right? So those sorts of case studies are few and far between. But the Financial Times article I wrote, there's a company that got into digital back in the mid-90s, and they're doing it pretty well, right? They don't have these sort of organizational silos that impede their success because they're focused on driving customer value across the organization, as opposed to saying, well, newspaper is one line of business and web is another, and now we're going to argue about things, right? So there are some examples. Your second question about Agile, well, that's the core of my writing. My last book is called The Agile Architecture Revolution. So bring me in and I'll give you 3 days of an answer for that. but that is obviously a key part of the story. One of the challenges is that word agile means different things in different contexts. Right? It refers to a particular approach to building software. When I use the word agility, I'm talking about the organization as a whole. But agile principles from the software development world in many cases transfer more broadly to the field of enterprise architecture, as long as you do it right. And that's really the core of my research. So come to Intellic site and learn more. Yeah. Another question? Oh, sorry.
Great presentation, Jason.
Thank you.
Really interesting. It is clear that this is not going to work unless and until the top management within the company buys onto this. So, comments about that. How do you make sure that the C-suite or even like the management is into this?
Well, there's two key principles that I actually talk about. I run a 3-day Agile architecture course. One is you have to connect any sort of transformation effort to the business drivers, the business pain points. If your top management doesn't think innovation is a priority, you're barking up the wrong tree. Right? There has to be an innovation pain point, because innovation or transformation, broadly speaking, involves change, and people hate to change. They will only change if not changing is just so painful, they have to change. Right? So unless your C-level executive management is in that position, they realize they have to change, and now they're looking to figure out how to change the best way they can. They're not ready for this story. And that's fine, right? If all they're doing is optimizing, then that's fine. Now, the other part of your question was? Yeah, well, one step at a time, right? And that's a page out of the Agile playbook. This isn't a big bang approach. This is a step-by-step iterative approach, because you have to take a step-by-step approach whenever a disruption is involved, because it's inherently unpredictable and it's inherently dynamic. Right? The marketplace today is not the same as it's going to be in 6 months or even in 1 month. Right? So you have to allow for change, which means anything you do is step by step. You can't put together a 5-year plan and say, in 5 years we're going to be more innovative and here's what we're going to do starting today. You just have no idea what the future holds. So you have to build an approach that is inherently iterative, which means step by step. And those early steps, they can be as easy as they need to be in order to get started. You start off with the baby steps. Yeah.
Hi, I sneaked over from the social analytics session to come listen, and it was great.
Great.
Curious, from corporations, usually the people need to move up that y-axis, and I find that corporations, that's where we are, is kind of that chasm between business and IT.
Yeah, very
and
common.
so my question, because usually the technology can follow the people and the culture, but my question is, how do you then move? Is it just simply getting IT and our technical partners to say, hey, leave us alone, like you're kind of saying, let us be a little messy, and then bring structure to it? Because I think we're trying to do both at the same time, and it's tricky. So I was just curious on your advice on how do you move against that x-axis to move more towards, hey, we're partners, and it's like kind of an organized chaos.
Well, obviously, it would take days to answer that question fully, but just to give you something just to sort of whet your appetite, it's important to understand, or for a moment, put your head into your CIO's, or put yourself in your CIO's shoes, or your head of IT, whoever that happens to be. They've spent years struggling to have more relevance for the business. They have been a cost center that business doesn't trust, right? And if you're a cost center, the CFO keeps cutting their budget because they're not providing value, or there's a perception they're not providing sufficient value. What the CIO really wants to do is, they want a seat at the board, in the C level, because their initial letter is a C, so that's where they want to be. The only way they can do that is to have direct impact on the customer relationship. And they've always known this, right? And especially since they've been doing with the help with the website, right, which is customer facing. So if the CIO knows that they need to have better focus on customer value, that means being collaborative with everybody who is responsible for the customer relationship, you folks, right, marketing. So, so now, the CIO is saying, wait a minute, we need to be collaborative. We have all of these great assets that belong to the organization and are running the business, and they are core capabilities that are essential to your digital effort. And so it's helping the IT organization understand that the only way they can achieve their own goals is by collaborating with the people responsible for the customer. And that's at least gets you started.
Any more questions? I know.
This is our lunch, so you may as well keep asking.
We're really hungry, so why don't you take a seat with him at the table and then...
Well, there's one more question.
We talked about the kind of the blend between trying to create a culture of innovative analysts. What if you separated an organization? You have a team that's just responsible for just innovation, and then just analysts, and just hope that they work well together. What would you think about that kind of structure? Well,
to some extent, this innovation team should be somewhat separate. So it should be managerially separate in the sense that the management is letting them do their own thing and self-organize. But they're cross-functional, so it's not like, oh, this is just marketing or product people and nobody else, right? So because this is a digital story. There's a technology as well as a marketing story. So it's cross-organizational, but it's still somewhat separate, organizationally speaking. But within the context of enterprise constraints. This is a whole separate talk I have. I'm talking about how governance fits into this story, right? It's one thing to say, if you're a startup, oh yeah, we'll just go do something wild and see if we can sell it. It's another thing if you're a bank or healthcare company, and there's all these regulatory constraints to what you can do. You have to work within those constraints. So now the challenge is, well, IT is in this role of, traffic cop, making sure that security and compliance and all this stuff is being maintained. How do we move them forward so they can do that without stifling the innovation? And that's sort of the bigger picture. And I've done some writing on this as well, because it's a difficult transition, right? IT has to modernize in order to support this more, this greater agility vision. But that level of change is different from the rest of this. So there's different parts of the organization have to change in different ways, and it all has to be coordinated. So there's it's easier said than done, but again, if you take it a step at a time and make sure you're focusing on the business problems that the executives feel are the most painful, then you have a path to success, even though it involves a lot of change across the organization.
Great.
Everybody wants to go for lunch, I know.
Okay, thank you so
Thank you.
much.